national interest, but also well attuned to the needs of other nations. The world's complex problems cannot be taken up neatly in an orderly sequence. Instead, we must be prepared to deal with issues systematically and often simultaneously as they arise. This will require a well-coordinated foreign policy establishment and a decision-making structure that is given comparable importance with domestic policy components of our national government. I do not for a moment wish to suggest that world leadership on the part of the United States should imply world domination. Clearly it does not and should not. Nor does it mean the U.S. must alone assume the mantle of leadership or become the world's policeman. But like it or not, we live in a global society. We must understand it. We must comprehend the forces that are affecting it. And we must act forcefully to protect our own interests as well as to promote the continued progress of all the world's peoples. In accepting the Business Council's medal last year, President Bush said, "Real peace is not an accident, it's an art form, the result of planning and patience and sometimes personal diplomacy." In his personal message to the program for tonight's event, Secretary General Boutros Ghali noted that the reaffirmation and strengthening of democratic principles is of particular importance at this time. I agree, of course, with both of these propositions. I would only add that ultimately the strength and security of our nation derives from the purposefulness, self-discipline, and character of our own people. At this pivotal moment in our history, we cannot afford to hide our heads in the sand. We must make sure that 200 years of scientific progress, economic growth, and democratic rule are allowed to serve as the basis for our positive and constructive leadership in the family of nations in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again from the bottom of my heart for the honor that you have bestowed on me this evening. Thank you very much.
Now, David really means the global union when he makes a statement.
Good morning, and thank you all very much for coming here to the department on this early Monday rainy morning. I'm very pleased to have a chance to meet with you on the very eve or moment of my departure for Mexico. I'm particularly honored to be back in the distinguished company of your founder, David Rockefeller, as well as John Avery and Ted Briggs. Ted was good enough to mention many who are here, and I especially welcome those who he mentioned, and I am very pleased that my colleague Mac McClarty, the President's counselor, is here. He'll be joining me on the trip to Mexico, but he'll be speaking with you before we both leave. I'm very pleased that Ted mentioned Acting Assistant Secretary Jeff Davidow as former ambassador to Venezuela and person with very wide experience in Latin America. I'm very pleased to have you know that he's going to be taking over in that key role and will be advancing our interests in Latin America and the Caribbean. This council and its members have played an invaluable role in supporting the triumph of open market democracies in our hemisphere. Through your commitment to dialogue, you have helped foster a deeper understanding among the leaders throughout the Americas, and as a channel between the United States government and the business community, you've helped to ensure that our policies meet the real needs of our companies and our workers. Since the day he took office, President Clinton has placed job creation and open and fair trade at the very center of our economic strategy. As you all know so well, he fought to ratify NAFTA and to complete the GATT-Uruguay round. He unified the leaders of the Asia-Pacific region to form there a commitment to open trade, and quite recently he and the leaders of the European Union have committed to build a new transatlantic marketplace with more open markets and more job creation. At the Miami summit, coming down to what interests us most, he helped to shape the consensus to negotiate a free trade area of the Americas that will encompass a $12 trillion market of 850 million consumers. His aim is to make this hemisphere an even more dynamic hub of the global economy, to open markets, to create jobs, and to lift living standards throughout this vital region. We remain on track to achieve by 2005 a free trade area of the Americas, which has begun to be called for shorthand purposes an FTAA. At the trade ministerials in Denver and Cartagena, we laid the foundations for negotiations, and we established working groups covering everything from free market access to intellectual property. We'll consider the recommendations of these working groups at the third trade ministerial next year in Brazil, where we will discuss at that time how to open the formal negotiations for an FTAA. In our effort to create an FTAA by 2005, I cannot stress enough the importance of your advice and support through your business forum and through other mechanisms. As I told business leaders a few weeks ago in Sao Paulo, you must remain involved and be intensively.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Again, we appreciate your being here with us. I would like to ask David Rockefeller to join us now, who is going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, John. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very special pleasure for me to be able to introduce our next speaker. Mac, as he's known both inside the Beltway and more broadly across the United States, is of course a lifelong friend of President Clinton and currently serves as counselor to the President. Prior to assuming his present role, he served ably for 2 years as the President's Chief of Staff. But before coming to Washington, Mac was chairman of the board and chief executive officer of Arkla, Inc., a Fortune 500 company that is one of this country's largest natural gas companies. Perhaps because of that background in the private sector, he has been able to be such an extraordinarily effective voice in the current administration for the private sector and for this hemisphere. And I think that the members of the Council of the Americas and business leaders throughout the hemisphere owe him a real debt of gratitude for being the eloquent advocate that he has been for the private sector and a reliable collaborator in the effort to advance the process of hemispheric economic integration. As many of you here know, Mac was a tireless supporter of the North American Free Trade Agreement and took principal responsibility for organizing the very successful Summit of the Americas in 1994. In my opinion, the summit's clear focus on trade issues and economic integration owed a great deal to the persistence within the councils of the Clinton administration of Mac McLarty. But just on a more personal note, I would have to say that the large number of conversations that Mac and I have had over the past several years
Now, why is a retired banker having a large number of conversations with President Clinton's chief of staff and counselor, Mac McLarty? Was he really meeting with Clinton, and McLarty was just included in the meeting? And has Rockefeller had a large number of conversations with every U.S. president since about 1965? And when he has these conversations with these presidents, does he come to the White House? Are they required to go to New York City? Do they meet at Camp David, or perhaps at the Rockefeller Ranch out at Jackson Hole? They do get together, we just don't know where it happens.
It leads me to feel that of all the people who have been involved in this administration, he, perhaps more than any other,